mentioned that you have two young adult children. One is addicted to alcohol and the other is addicted to heroin. Which one is worse? Who are you more worried about? How will this person be perceived when you try to seek help for them to deal with their addiction? Should there be a difference in attitude when helping these two young people? This is Between Us, Stories of Unconscious Bias. I am Smita Tharoor. Hello everybody, I'd like to introduce Ethan Nadelmann. Ethan was described by the American magazine Rolling Stone as the point man for drug policy reform efforts and the real drug czar. Ethan is widely regarded as the outstanding proponent of drug policy reform, both in the United States and abroad. He founded and directed first the Lindesmith Center and then the Drug Policy Alliance from 1994 to 2017, during which time he and his colleagues were at the forefront of dozens of successful campaigns to legalize marijuana and advance other alternatives to the war on drugs. Ethan currently hosts the leading podcast on all things related to drugs, and it's called PSYCHOACTIVE, if you want to search that. So I'm really pleased that Ethan has given me time to speak and share his stories of unconscious bias around our understanding about what this means in relation to drugs. Welcome, Ethan, and thank you.
Smita, it's a pleasure to be on your podcast. Thank you for inviting me.
So as you know, we're talking about unconscious bias, Ethan. In your understanding, what do those words mean before we even start talking about drugs and drug policy? What do they mean to you?
I'll tell you, Smith, I actually looked up the dictionary definition of bias,
Sure.
right?
Okay.
And it can be a prejudice either against or in favor of something. And typically one that we regard as something that's unfair bias or prejudice. And
Exactly.
so that's the way I think about it. It's where we, unfairly have a preference for something for or against without really being aware of it.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. A lot of people use the word bias only in a negative connotation, but it could very much be that I have a positive bias towards something. So absolutely. But I mean, you've had an enormous amount of experience around drugs and drug policy. And I'm amused that Rolling Stone called you the real drug czar. And so I want to know more about this and your experiences and your understanding. I wonder if you could share a story around that.
Yeah, sure, Smita. For me, it's an interesting thing because I've spent decades. I'm now 65, and I got interested in the issue of drug policy back in the early 80s, almost 40 years ago. So I've devoted virtually all of my adult life to both learning as much as I can about psychoactive, by which I mean mind-altering drugs, and the policies and the politics and the culture and the history and all around that. And not just learning and teaching about it, but also then becoming deeply involved in trying to change the way people think and to change government policies and laws, with the overall orientation that drug policies were overly grounded, both in the US and many other countries, in a combination of ignorance, fear, prejudice, and profit. And far better for drug policies to be grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. So that was really the overall frame of my work throughout really my life. And
But you talk about
that,
40 years ago, Ethan. So
yeah.
you're a little stripling of a 25-year-old. When a 25-year-old, all he or she wants to do is actually experiment with drugs. And maybe I'm there having an unconscious bias here, I don't know. So what's your story there, age 18 or 20? Perhaps when you first actually tried it. Is there a story there that made you more interested?
I'll tell you, it's an interesting question because I grew up in a fairly traditional family, a Jewish family, and my dad was a rabbi. My mother had grown up in a somewhat Orthodox family. We were very Sabbath observant and all of that. I didn't really, I got drunk occasionally as a teenager, but it wasn't really until I went to college, actually at McGill in Montreal initially, where I tried marijuana and I enjoyed it. And it wasn't getting in the way of my studies. And I also enjoyed alcohol, but it was pretty obvious that sometimes when people drank too much alcohol, they could throw up, they could get violent, they could do stupid things. It was clear they shouldn't be driving. Whereas with marijuana, you didn't see that many problems associated with it. So I sort of wondered about that. Like, and why were friends getting busted occasionally for marijuana? All that just struck me as being somewhat off. And then a few years later, I tried some of the more psychedelic drugs, especially mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms. And those were powerful and overwhelmingly positive experiences. And many of my friends did that. And I knew a few people, who did too much, smoked too much pot, and it was a problem. But by and large, I could see this wasn't that big a deal. And yet there was something fundamentally wrong with the law. I was also, studying politics, and I remembered reading John Stuart Mill's classic treatise on liberty, where he distinguishes between other regarding offenses and self-regarding offenses. And John Stuart Mill's basic brief in the book he wrote in the mid-19th century was that for those activities that primarily involve yourself and only incidentally other people, the government should basically keep its hands off. Whereas those activities that involve direct harm to other people, that's where the government has a proper role to play with regulation and especially with criminal law. So that kind of framework, just appealed to me. So I kept that in the back of my mind. And then some years later, in the early 80s, I was in graduate school and law school, and I was tiring of my work on Middle East politics and despairing a bit there. And some friends of mine said to me, Ethan, you've always been interested in the deviant side of things. And, you're always trying to get your fellow graduate students at Harvard high on marijuana. Why don't you do something about that? And I went to see a few professors at Harvard, one in the law school, one in the Kennedy School, and one in my Department of Government and Arts and Sciences. And they all said, sure, give it a go. Start working on this area. And that's how I got started.
Huh, that's just wonderful because, I mean, firstly, you were obviously a good student. And here's an unconscious bias in itself. I'm talking about
Mhm.
college rather than postgraduate degree because you got so involved in the politics and the books you were reading, it started making you question even more the pluses and the minuses. And I like the fact that you say, if you're doing something by yourself, why is it that the government or the police or, somebody else needs to tell you how you should manage your own life? Because it's your life that you're managing. That's what you're
Right.
saying. Briefly interrupting this conversation with Ethan to share some great news. If this podcast on drugs and drug policy interests you, you will be pleased to know that today's podcast is sponsored by Audible. You may want to hear the book The Age of Intoxication by Benjamin Breen, narrated by Sean Runnett. A Turkish drink called coffee increases alertness. Tobacco cures cancer. Such beliefs circulated in the 17th and 18th century, an era when the term drug encompassed everything from herbs and spices to deadly poisons. From the sickly sweet tobacco that helped finance the Atlantic slave trade to the cannabis that an East Indies merchant sold to the natural philosopher, Breen shows how drugs have entangled with science and empire from the very beginning. If you're interested in this book, all you have to do for this free book and a free month subscription is to sign up to www.audibletrial.com/Tharoor Associates. It's important that you use this link that I have shared to get this free subscription. So sign up to audibletrial.com/Tharoor Associates.
And I will say, Smita, that I think even as I was heading towards my PhD and becoming an assistant professor, there was a part of me, maybe more subconscious than conscious at the time, which realized that I wanted to connect my intellectual pursuits with something I cared about personally, something that I believed in sort of politically and ideologically. And that period in the early 80s, I mean, there was obviously the issue of gay rights, but I'm not gay and I sympathize with it, but it didn't seem like an issue where I would be deeply involved. Civil rights, was kind of in a more quiescent phase. And that was also one where, as a white man, one could play a constructive role, but this was really one where, people who were black should play a leadership role. And the drug issue was one where, even though I was not a problematic drug user, it was something where, none of the fact, anytime I got high with a joint, I risked getting arrested. And in fact, hundreds of thousands of young people, not just black, but also white, were getting busted. And it struck me that this maybe was something where my intellectual curiosity about psychoactive drugs, historically, cross culturally, in terms of public opinion and law and history, all of this, that could be something that on some level would be connected to actually fighting for freedom and justice. And I think that kind of evolved. And during graduate school, I was kind of learning everything I could and going to work in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau and interviewing drug enforcement agents all around the world, getting to know those guys. And by the way,
Hmm.
when it comes to unconscious bias, from one perspective, I would have thought of the guys who were involved at the US DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, as kind of evil. But by virtue of working in the government and getting to know these people, you begin to realize that even the people who were on the other side of this, who were locking up people in ways that I thought were unjust, that basically they range like anybody else, from being basically good guys doing their job to being real jerks or ideologues. So I
Mm.
had, already an empathic view even towards my opposition right from
Yeah,
the
it's not
beginning.
an either or, is it? That's what you're saying.
No,
It can't
no.
be. Everything is far more nuanced than that. So, in your, experience of so many years of learning and understanding and talking about drug policy around the world, do you feel that there's some really relevant, obvious unconscious biases that rear their ugly head every time? And I'm talking about negative reaction
Yeah.
to the idea of drug policy.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I mean, just one thing that appealed to this to me was that the more I studied the issue back in the 80s, the more I realized that the more you read of the science, the history, the economics, the more you realize that drug policy should be grounded essentially in public health and a human rights sort of approach, right? With the criminal law and the punitive elements being at the edges. Yet at the same time, public opinion and the media and the politicians were all going the other direction. And a lot of that had to do with simple unconscious bias on the part of most people. Most people, alcohol was the devil we knew. People had an unconscious bias in favor of alcohol in the U.S. and dozens and probably most countries around the world. Right?
Yes,
Maybe
the
not an
UK
Islamic
included.
world,
Yeah,
other. Oh, UK especially, but I mean,
yeah.
even in places like Scandinavia, which had a very difficult problem with alcohol, even they had an unconscious bias in favor of alcohol. And then they look at marijuana and they think, oh, that's the dangerous drug. That's the drug that automatically leads to people using heroin. That's the drug that causes kids to drop out of school. That's the drug that causes people to become hippies or anti war activists. That's the drug that damages your brain or your chromosomes. And what I realized is that there was a very powerful, sometimes conscious or unconscious bias, where people just, even though the scientists outright would say by any objective measure, alcohol is dramatically more dangerous, not just than marijuana, but even more dangerous than other of the illegal drugs, even drugs like heroin or cocaine. That was just seen as preposterous by most, not just Americans, but around the world. And for me, that presented both an intellectual puzzle, and challenge, as well as one that seemed like, well, God, what an exciting thing to devote my life to try to challenging a popular bias. I mean, the bias, one point I coined a phrase, but I've never been happy with it, what I called drugism, right? And drugism, to some extent, is the acceptance of a prejudice against people who use certain types of drugs over others, right? And in a way, it almost survives that even as sort of racism and sexism and other things have been increasingly delegitimized, at least in the public sphere in many countries around the world, drugism,
Mm,
the thing that you can say, if
I
somebody's
like
a
that.
heroin addict, if
Yeah,
somebody's a pothead, you can say the worst about them, and people will just
and get
implicitly
away with
assume
it.
it's true.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't have the culture of saying, "Excuse me, but I don't think that's fair or right." And in fact, and
Mm-hmm.
correct me if I'm wrong, Ethan, I think 'cause in the United Kingdom, it is still illegal, smoking, cannabis, marijuana, and that kind of thing. I could be wrong. You
Well,
have
I mean,
you have the finger on
actually,
the pulse and all this.
yeah, no, I mean, it's still illegal, like technically illegal. Now in the United States, about one third of the states have legalized it, but the federal government has not so far done so. It's legal now in Canada. Uruguay was the first country to legalize cannabis I mean, Colorado and Washington were the first political jurisdictions back in 2012. Uruguay became the first country in 2013. Canada became the second one a few years ago. And now there's growing momentum. I mean, in parts of Europe, I think Malta, as an example,
Certainly,
Germany
Amsterdam,
has
I would
been.
thinking.
Amsterdam's an interesting case where in the mid 70s, they changed the law, but they didn't legalize. Usually, legalization means that you allow the over the counter sale the way you would with alcohol or cigarettes or other products. And what the Dutch did was he said, we're not going to legalize this. We're not going to legally regulate marijuana. What we're going to do is to decriminalize it. When people possess it, we're not going to arrest them or fine them. And we're going to allow what we call coffee shops, like informal establishments, to sell this. But they never have gone as yet to a full legal retail system, which is where you really get rid of the black market and you really begin to tax it and regulate it and have
Right,
a kind
right.
of constructive, responsible policy.
Hmm. Just to come back to this whole idea of reaction or unconscious bias towards drugism, I love that word because, the world over, you're absolutely right. We are all trying very hard to work at trying to be more inclusive in relation to gender and race and religion and so many things like that. But when drugs come into it, it continues to be seen in a negative way. Then is
Hmm.
there a further level to this idea of what you're calling drugism? I mean, have you got certain more, because drugism is a big word. I mean, what does the word drugs even
Well,
mean, I would say? Then, of course, beneath all of that headline, what kind of unconscious biases are we talking about?
I'll give you a few examples, Smita. I mean, one is, sometimes people ask me, what are the most powerful drugs known to humankind? And people say, oh, heroin or cocaine, or maybe someone would even say alcohol. And I'll sometimes come back with, well, actually, sugar, fat, salt, right? And you look, for example, at the ways in which, obesity and related diseases has just increased in my country and a whole range of others around the world dramatically in the last 20, 30 years. I mean, human bodies, human weight has just, we've gone through a kind of revolution in the human organism in a way. And to some extent, it's because of variables, including the ways in which multinational producers of foods have become ever more sophisticated at combining sugar, fat, salt in ways that hit the brain, not unlike the ways that cocaine hits the brain. And we also know, for example, that the consequences of obesity in terms of shortening people's lives, in terms of health disabilities, in terms of cost to the economy, that those in fact approach or exceed the cost of drug abuse around the world. But we don't think about it that way. We don't think, oh, that my appeal to those processed foods and all that, that's a drug-like thing. But in point of fact, it is, right? I mean, so that's just one example. I'll give you a second example that reflects my own unconscious bias. That even as I was reading and learning, I had read that in fact, most people, if you have access to a clean, legal supply of heroin, you can actually consume heroin every day for many decades. You could drive a car, make love to your spouse, bring up a family, hold a job, and live to be 80 or 90 years old. That pure heroin does not basically kill people. Alcohol will destroy your liver, cigarettes will destroy your lungs, cocaine will damage your heart if you're taking it in high concentrations, right? But that opioids, in fact, people don't destroy your internal organs, right? And when you take heroin, it gets converted into morphine. And I knew the stories that, for example, the founder of modern American surgery, William Halsted, who founded the famous Johns Hopkins Medical School, had been a morphine addict virtually his entire life, even as he became, a major figure in the history of medicine. Many other famous people. So I knew that, but to somehow believe it. And then one day I had an experience sitting with a fellow I knew, a British fellow, who had been active in the drug policy effort. And he said, excuse me, I have to go shoot my heroin now. And I said, huh? He said, oh, yeah, I have a script from my doctor in the UK, because in the UK, doctors always were allowed to prescribe in ways that doctors in other countries weren't. And I said, well, can I watch? And he said, sure. So we sat down and he kind of pulled down his pants a bit and he injected sort of in his thigh near the groin area. And I was kind of waiting for him to nod off. And instead, we just kept chatting. And he didn't change at all, even before, during, and after the injection. And I said, so what's it like for you? And he said, well, it just, when I take the shot, it just makes me feel a little calmer. And, if I didn't take the shot for a day, I would start to have some withdrawal and feel very uncomfortable. But for me, sitting with him in that moment, as he injected, as we had a normal conversation, it was a real eye opener to realize that, I had to change the way, in the movies, they show people injecting heroin and either nodding off into some amazing bliss or overdosing, or they show people taking other drugs and becoming crazed. So seeing that reality right in my face really helped more deeply inform my understanding of what it was
I'm trying
I
to
was
visualize
advocating
that,
that.
Ethan. Yeah.
Interesting cross-cultural example. If you think about the history of opium, And you go back to the late 19th century when you had this triangle of the UK, India, and China. And in China, the use of opium became associated with the Opium Wars and British imperialism and the insult to China, and opium addiction, which was widespread among all classes, was seen in a very, very negative light. But meanwhile, in India, you had roughly comparable percentage of the population using opium. It was traditionally used in medicine. It was consumed in all sorts of forms. And there was not the great hysteria around opium in India, in most of India,
In
the way you
those
saw in
days, no,
China, right?
no.
And
Yeah.
in some ways, I make an analogy here. It's like if you compare the way alcohol is perceived in the Mediterranean countries to the compared with the way alcohol is perceived in, say, Scandinavia, right? In Scandinavia, until not long ago, you didn't drink unless it was to get drunk. It was seen, Scandinavia was almost the only countries besides the U.S. that prohibited alcohol 100 years ago, or went almost to prohibition. Whereas in Mediterranean, you go to Italy, Spain, whatever, you drink, you eat, you have wine. It's not seen as a horrible, destructive thing. It's almost seen as a healthy thing. And I
It's a
think the
very much a
disparity
cultural
between
thing. That's what you're
exactly, and
saying.
I think
Yeah.
India and China, even though India is obviously enormously diverse internally, and there were different views from depending on which state you were in, it still was a big contrast with China. India never went through some huge opium war and a whole thing like that. So it's about culture. It's about,
But there
or
was
even
one other word you used, Ethan, because it's certainly about culture, and that makes an enormous amount of sense. But you also
Mhm.
used the word class. I mean, when you were, I think specifically when you were talking about the opium stories and the fact that across the classes, and I think that's the phrase you used in India those days, it was perfectly normal for people to use opium. So my question to you, I suppose, is what about today? What does that look like in relation to class then? Do we have unconscious
Well,
biases around class and
well, I mean,
drugs? That's an
interestingly,
unusual combination in my head.
In the United States, the drug wars are very much associated, and quite correctly, with race and racism, especially involving Black people. But it also goes back historically. The first opium prohibition laws were directed at Chinese minorities, Chinese migrants in the US. The first anti-marijuana laws were directed at Mexican and Mexican Americans in the US. The first anti-cocaine laws at Blacks. So there's always been a racial dimension. But the class dimension is really overwhelming in a way that's not fully acknowledged. First of all, you take as an example, like alcohol, right? We know that alcohol. Well, here, let me give you a perfect example, a way to explain this. Imagine an editor of a newspaper tells a journalist, "I want you to do me a series of stories, do a series of stories about alcohol in our community." And the journalist goes, okay, and he goes out and he goes to the rowdiest bars, he goes to the jails, he goes to the meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and the alcohol treatment clinics, right? And he comes back and he has this devastating portrait of alcohol in the county where he's living. And the editor looks at him and he goes, now, wait a second. And he opens up his drawer of his desk and he pulls out a little flask of whiskey and he goes, are you saying this? And he goes, what about the vineyards? And what about the places in the wine tastings? And what about where people drink beer responsibly? And what about the cocktail bars? Isn't that the real story? And you're just showing me a little piece of the story? You get the point. Well, now
I
imagine the
do.
same editor says to the journalist, I want you to write me a series of stories about methamphetamine in our county. And the journalist goes out and he goes to the same places. He goes to really down and out places in poor areas. He goes to the Narcotics Anonymous meetings. He goes to the police station where they have the drug addicts locked up. And he comes back and he writes this devastating portrait of methamphetamine. And the editor goes, great job. I love it. And he doesn't stop to say, no, wait a second. Are these all the methamphetamine users? Or are these just a deviant minority of methamphetamine users? Who's
Hmm.
getting people interested in methamphetamine in the first place? It's obviously not the people with their teeth falling out. There must be people who are using methamphetamine without having a problem. There must be housewives who are using methamphetamine and it just helps them get all their jobs done during their day. There must be all sorts of people using this who obviously don't want to talk to a journalist, but who may in fact represent the majority of all methamphetamine consumers. But that bias is so overwhelming and so powerful that even when I lay out this story, most of your listeners are going to be saying, oh, that's impossible, that's impossible, that's impossible. Nobody can use that drug safely or responsibly, right? It's an overwhelmingly powerful bias in the way we perceive things. With marijuana in the US and other countries, we were ultimately able to challenge that bias. And in part, That was by focusing our attention on the people who used marijuana for medical purposes, people who were living with multiple sclerosis, people who were suffering from AIDS wasting syndrome, people who were having nausea, post chemotherapy. So they were sympathetic people, they were older, and for them, they were using marijuana and they were using it in ways that were essentially medical, right? And so normal people who might have been anti marijuana got to see people who were using marijuana in a way that was not threatening. It wasn't the high school dropout. It wasn't with all their fears, right? And that helped transform public opinion around what marijuana was. If older people could be using this safely and they weren't really getting all that high and it was being helpful, then maybe we should relax around it.
But
Now,
then,
there's a
therefore,
lot.
you're saying it's not the same, for example, methamphetamines, which is what you mentioned earlier.
Well, let me give you another example. We know that millions and millions, tens of millions of young people, mostly boys in my country and some others, are prescribed Ritalin, are prescribed Adderall, right? Are prescribed, these drugs that help them sit still and focus better, right? And we know that it actually really does help some of these teenagers. And we also know that sometimes it's overprescribed and inappropriately, right? Now, if you were to take those pills, Demerol or Adderall or whatever the pills are called, whichever country, but basically they're stimulants. If you were, right, to open up those pills, grind them up, and inject them, the experience would be just like methamphetamine is, where we have all these horrific notions of what it does. Conversely, if you were to take methamphetamine and instead of injecting or smoking it, in a little pill form, it would essentially be no different than the pills we're giving our teenage kids, right? So we assume there's some massive difference between methamphetamine and the drugs we give to tens of millions of young, mostly boys.
I get you. So, what you're saying really is that depending on the drug, the unconscious bias continues even today across the world because they make assumptions that some drugs, okay, I mean, certainly there have been world leaders. I'm thinking of Boris Johnson, for example, and the US, I think might have been Clinton, who suggested, oh, yes, I have smoked marijuana. And they have not been arrested and they've not been put in jail for that reason. And so people are looking towards cannabis, marijuana, same thing, slightly differently. But when it's a different drug, we continue to believe that all the things that we've been sort of brought up to believe that it's not good for you, it could kill you, you're a drug addict, and so on.
That's right. Well, it's interesting, because, with marijuana, there's been this massive transformation of public opinion, right? I mean, if you go back to the mid 1980s, only 20% of Americans thought marijuana should be legal, and now it's like 68%, right? And even Republicans and conservatives and people who go to church all the time who are typically, very anti-marijuana are now split 50-50 on it, right? So we saw a change with marijuana. The other place is now people are referring to what's called the psychedelics renaissance. Drugs like LSD, magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, things like this. These were drugs where people had enormous fears or associations with the old Timothy Leary, tune in, drop out type view that, all this. And now, once again, that you have scientists, institutions all around Europe, around the United States, UK, are showing these really extraordinary results in using drugs, psychedelics, as well as MDMA, the drug that's otherwise known as ecstasy, which is not really a psychedelic, but it has, a strong effect, that they're showing that these drugs can help people enormously in dealing with PTSD, in dealing with intractable depression, in dealing with high levels of anxiety, in dealing with a whole range of mental illness conditions. And so you now see a very rapid transformation in opinion regarding psychedelics to the point that, even much to my astonishment, the state of Oregon voted to basically legalize the medicinal use of psychedelics in a ballot initiative just last year. We're probably going to see other states following suit. So I think, obviously marijuana and the psychedelics have the least potential for addiction. And they have the highest sort of benefit cost ratio, right? I mean, the use of these drugs by people is probably overwhelmingly a net benefit if you look at how people experience that. Whereas if you look at cocaine or heroin, especially in the current world, one would not say something like that. One would not say that there's a cumulative net benefit to those things. But I think people are getting more sophisticated, at least in some countries in the West, around this stuff. there has been a kind of opening up and evolution. In some respects, oftentimes people analogize it to what's happened with the gay rights movement, where the ways we thought about homosexuality 50 years ago, have evolved dramatically. And part of that is by people having personal contact and people's views and understanding becoming more sophisticated, more consistent with the science, and more humane.
The issue, though, I'm thinking, and I'm hoping that that's exactly what's going to happen. But unlike, say, the gay rights, you've got so many other sub layers to this whole idea of unconscious bias towards drugs and drug policy. Certainly,
Mm.
two that you've already mentioned is race and class. Perhaps the class angle we may be able to change in the next 50 years, but then the race is the big one, certainly in the West, don't you think? In
Well,
terms of wandering down the street and you see a black person smoking marijuana and you see a white person smoking marijuana and you think you need to arrest one of them, and the chances are the black person's arrested. And the
yeah, I mean,
assumption is that black people are the ones who smoke more or the ones who deal with drugs more.
that's right. In fact, one of the things that actually helped our advocacy efforts was pointing out, beginning 10, 15 years ago, that if the police were to randomly stop 100 young black men, 100 young brown men, Hispanic, and 100 young white men, that roughly the same percentage of each group would have some marijuana in their pocket, right? That blacks and brown were no more likely or no less likely than whites to have marijuana in their pocket. But that in virtually every city in America, the blacks were 2 to 10 times more likely than the white kids to get arrested, right? And that was very important. Us showing that was important in moving public opinion, in part among older black people, because a lot of older black people had their own bias against marijuana. And it was by pointing out to them that, look who's really getting busted here. I mean, look, America's mostly white, so still the majority of people getting busted were white, but the black person was disproportionately likely to get arrested wherever they lived, right? Either because the police had a much bigger presence in black neighborhoods, or if you saw a black kid in a white neighborhood, they were more suspect, right? So I think in that sense, there was certainly that bias. And I think to some extent, I really believe that racism is almost like an ineradicable cancer in human society, right? That we can reach moments of greater enlightenment, we can chill out, we can mellow out about it. I think that especially happens in societies where you have high levels of miscegenation, of marriage and sex among different races. But then, quite frankly, even as you get beyond racism, you then get into colorism, right? Like, so within the black community, between lighter skinned and darker skinned, or things like
Absolutely.
that. So I think that those elements of bigotry and prejudice, they are certainly dramatically less now than they were 150 years ago, 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. If you look in my country, if you ask the public opinion question, how would you feel about a white person, their kid marrying a black person? What you find is, whereas maybe 70, 80% would have been negative about that 50 years ago, now 78% are perfectly fine with it, right?
Yeah.
So there is an evolution, but it doesn't go away and it can always rear its ugly head. I mean, as for example, as you see happening in Europe and America and other places, where you have a large scale sudden migration, either because of a flow of refugees or whatever, and everybody freaks out. You look with the flow of refugees from Syria to Europe, and everybody freaks out, and all of a sudden, the dark side of the popular, psyche of white people, turns sour. And we've had the same thing happen in my country. So it's there. We've made progress. But meanwhile, the issues around class too are just, yeah, I think they are almost inescapable. I mean, and especially in societies which don't deal well with equalizing class differences. You look at some of the social democracies in Europe, they've done a much better job than, say, the US, which has a very wonderfully dynamic capitalist society, but also has some of the, ever worsening class divisions.
But then, Ethan, in that case, I mean, I could talk with you forever because there's just so much that we are all learning, the listeners and I. But is there something simple that we can all take away from you? You're the expert in this area. What can we learn from all the different examples and stories you've shared that can help us to challenge
Well,
our own unconscious biases when we think about drugs?
I think part of
Or
it
what do you
is
do on a
part,
daily basis? I suspect you live it, breathe it. So it
yeah.
might not be the same answer.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, I think two things. I mean, the one obviously is that being informed, looking at the science, asking the hard questions about the way the media covers things, the way the politicians talk about things to appeal to people's fears. That's one key thing. But even aside from that, there is a basic sort of core principle of the work that I've done all these decades. And it's the principle that nobody should be punished simply for what we put into our bodies, absent harm to others, right? That there is no legitimate basis in science, in medicine, in ethics, the Bible, you name it, for distinguishing between or discriminating against people based upon which substance they put in their body. There is no legitimate basis for saying to a parent who, God forbid, has one kid addicted to alcohol and one kid addicted to heroin, that with your kid who's addicted to alcohol, we're going to try to deal with that as much as possible outside the criminal justice system, as long as they don't get behind the wheel of a car or beat somebody up. But your kid who's addicted to heroin, we're going to throw them in jail if we even catch them doing something in the privacy of their own home. That there's no legitimate basis, that the key thing is to hold people responsible for the harms they do to others, right? For somebody who takes drugs and starts driving recklessly or hurts somebody or gets violent or beats their spouse or their kid, well, they need to be held responsible. And saying they were addicted may be an explanation, but it cannot be an excuse. But meanwhile, the fact that one person chooses to put drug X, Y, or Z in their body, as opposed to drug A, B, or C in their body, it should not be a basis for discriminating against them or amongst them.
Thank you for that. Certainly for those of us who have young, children, or for us who are choosing to do it ourselves, it's very, very important to challenge our own unconscious biases in terms of what this means to the larger world. I've really enjoyed learning and understanding so much about this, and I appreciate giving us your time, Ethan. Ethan Nadelmann, thank
Listen,
you
I'm
so
honored to.
much.
Yes, I'm honored to be on your podcast. I love the theme of it. I love what you're doing. So thank you ever so much for having me on.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. I have been told that this podcast is ranked in the top 3% globally and heard by people in 98 countries. Thank you, listener, wherever you are, whether it's Albania, Afghanistan, Nigeria or Nepal, Sweden or Saudi Arabia. We could not have this podcast without you, the listener. As always, if you like this episode, please do share. I would also like to thank Jack Godfrey for his original music for Season 6.